Well, welcome to our second educator webinar of our spring series, Teaching Techniques to Incorporate College Prep for Your Students with Intellectual Disabilities. Our objectives for this particular webinar are kind of threefold. I'm going to always go over a review of what inclusive higher education programs are at the Colorado level, let you know what are our options for students with intellectual disabilities. Then we're going to dive into, on the first part, understanding universally designed teaching strategies, which is what's really promoted at the college level in this current season, and the mutual benefit of that and how that can start being incorporated at the K-12 level. And then we're going to lean into examples of teaching techniques specifically geared towards college readiness skills. We're going to look at a couple charts of here are the skills that we see students needing to be working on and how can you actually implement that in your classroom. So that's the hope. Looking at about an hour is kind of where we're at, but we'll have time for Q&A as needed. So as a reminder, our staff, so I work for In Pathways to Inclusive Higher Education. We're a nonprofit that works with the entire state of Colorado to just equip families and students and educators to know about inclusive higher education for their students with ID. So our team is small but mighty. We've got our executive director, Tracy Murphy, and then myself as the community engagement coordinator, Shayna Lang. Our contact information is always there because we want to be a resource to you. We know that all the different players in that conversation of transition after K-12 can have lots of different questions, and we want to either be able to answer them directly or resource you with the people that can also answer those more effectively for you. So always feel free to reach out. My cell phone and my email is probably the quickest response you'll be able to get, but we are happy to help in any way that we can. So as a picture of who we are, IN exists to create inclusive college opportunities in Colorado for students with intellectual disabilities. And when we talk about creating inclusive higher education opportunities, that means partnering with colleges and universities to develop programs that specifically serve this population of students while being inclusive in their general college campus. And just like any other college student, they're working towards these big goals. And the goals that we really see in these programs for our students with ID is academic growth, that they're learning something that they're excited about, social development, that they're connecting with peers just like them in the same stage of life, career advancement, they're working, they're navigating what they want to do in their future, and then independence, really seeing them be able to thrive. So our inclusive higher education programs are focused around all of those. We call those our 4 pillars of support. I do always make a mention that so Tracy and myself, we do not provide those direct services to the students on those campuses. We work closely with the program staff that do that. So we run a Colorado consortium of all the program staff that run inclusive higher education programs, talking through best practice, making sure we're all on the same page and resourcing and serving our students with ID really well. So I will not go into a huge amount of detail on this, but I always launch my overview of inclusive higher education in Colorado with this timeline, because I think it's so important for us to see how laws over time have developed to open the door to college for students with more intensive needs, like those with intellectual or developmental disabilities. So it really wasn't until 2008 that we saw legislation happening at the national level that said, hey, this population of students are leaving K-12 and oftentimes sitting on couches or working jobs that they're not passionate about. And we need to be able to develop more skills in them, equip them for that more meaningful future that they're after. And so they launched programs across the nation, developing inclusive programs for students with ID. It wasn't until 2016 that Colorado jumped in on that and launched our first pilot programs for students with intellectual disabilities. And now the ball just keeps on rolling. So 2020 is when we saw our first graduates, and I'll talk a bit about some of our outcomes that we're seeing from them. 2022, we passed more legislation here in Colorado to say, let's add more programs across the state. Let's reach out to rural areas so that students with ID in those communities can also receive the same mutual benefit of being included in college. So we're excited to see 2 to 4 more colleges or universities over the next year be able to open their doors and create their own program to serve this population. So we're just excited. That timeline just keeps on going, making sure that this population of students is being included and then equipped for the futures that they want. So inclusive higher education programs, in brief, are only offered at select institutions. So they are not required at all colleges or universities like a traditional disability services office is. And that is because these students are admitted to these programs through an alternative admission criteria. They don't have to meet the classic college expectations, maybe a traditional diploma or SAT or ACT tests, or even an IQ component. That's not something that's required of them. They have an alternative route to being admitted. Students within these programs are receiving a certificate credential rather than a traditional degree. That's for a number of reasons, mainly because the students within these programs are able to access modifications. That's a really big component of them pursuing inclusive higher education, is that they need a modification to the academic coursework in order to be fully included. So most of their courses are going to have modifications, and therefore they can't earn the same degree that their peers would if they're pursuing a full course load, all of the expectations. But instead, these students are earning a certificate credential that's consistent across all of our programs, so there's weight to it. And they're able to piecemeal courses together that really focus on developing skills for their particular job goal and future goals. And they're able to have that academic rigor meet their cognitive level as needed. So their certificate is technically considered like a modified certificate, but it's accredited by the institution. It's something that's offered. They get to participate in graduation ceremonies, all of those things. But that's a really big delineation that I would say if you're working with different types of students and varying needs. If a student is capable of pursuing an associate's degree or higher, and that's something that they want to pursue, their cognition would allow them to do that. We want to pursue that outside of inclusive higher ed. If they are unable to do that, inclusive higher ed allows them to be included into the classrooms while receiving a certificate that meets them at their cognitive level. And then so with that, students primarily within these programs are students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Or I say, or we talk a little bit about the gray area of those students, because there's lots of students with varying needs and maybe their diagnosis doesn't identify intellectual disabilities. Really what we're looking at is students that wouldn't meet college entry criteria and would need additional support specifically in that academic region where they would need modifications in their programs, but also will require additional supports just for navigating campus, social engagement, independent living. So it doesn't have to be just intellectual disability, though that's kind of the umbrella that we work with. Students, as I mentioned, are receiving accommodations and modifications. They have more intensive staff and peer mentor support. They're fully included on college campuses. So even with all of that support, and we'll chat about that in a bit, it's not a special education program on a college campus. They're fully included and the supports wrap around them. And then the support that is offered is in 4 key domains, which I mentioned earlier. But it's really academics, social, career, and independence. If you have any questions about these particular things, we have more in-depth webinars that speak to what do these programs look like, what are the services that are being offered. So I'm always happy to resource you with that and point you towards that for a little bit more depth. But just in general, we're looking at that fully included academic world where students get to choose 2 courses, college courses from the general course catalog that are in line with their job goals and what they want to grow in. So they get to choose 2 of those each semester. And then they also have 1 direct instruction course where they're being taught some of the self-advocacy skills, some of the employment development skills that they need directly. That's often being taught by their program staff. As I mentioned, they're going to be pursuing that certificate. But they really get to choose their area of study. They're not limited to a certain select amount of courses. They get to come in and say, here's what's offered at this institution. What is a realistic goal for you within these categories? What do you want to pursue? What do you want to grow in? And then at the social level, students are engaged all across campus, freshman fraternities, joining clubs, starting clubs, all of the things that really allow them to grow in confidence and leadership and full involvement on the campus. They're going to be largely supported by peer mentors in this particular section. So these programs are run by key staff, and then they have tons of peer mentors that are hired, neurotypical peers that are hired to support this population across campus and be more of a natural support to them rather than having like a para-educator walk around to a club event with you. So that's a really big component for the social engagement piece. Go ahead, Remy, you got a question? Yeah.
Yeah, I do have a question. I also put a couple there in the chat. Hey, first of all, I want to make sure I have this right in my mind. What you just talked about is this program is designed for students who are not pursuing a college degree. Instead, because if they're pursuing a college degree, then they actually are not part of this program. Program is for students who are not pursuing a college degree and instead are going to take 2 classes each semester toward a certificate. Is that accurate?
That is correct. That is correct.
Okay.
So students that can receive a degree, meaning an associate's degree or higher, would not be in inclusive higher education services. Instead, they would be using what is required by law at all universities and colleges, which is just the disability services office, where they can receive accommodations, but they wouldn't be able to receive these additional 4 pillars support in the modification level. So that's a pretty key delineation. And then, so the select institutions are just institutions that have put forth, passion and people and money to say, we want to resource this population. And I'll show you the list of the 4 programs available in the state of Colorado. And I noticed that your question is specifically to the community college system, because this is oftentimes we see with community college systems, because it's open access or open enrollment. Any student with any level of need can apply and be admitted to those institutions. So we have one pilot program that started back in 2016 at Arapahoe Community College, and they have really built a robust community college model to say this is something that they want to share with multiple community colleges if they jump in and say, we want to offer this as well. So it's not right now a staple of all community colleges. Obviously that's a dream, down the line, but it's absolutely something that is replicable, and something that we want to encourage other community colleges to join in on.
All right. And so on that, when you said the term select, it's not that y'all are selecting institutions self-select in.
Yes, correct.
And then secondly, if I was to make contact or have contact with my local community college, CMC or CNCC, I could tell them potentially to make contact with Arapahoe and learn how this works, and then they could self-select in.
Exactly.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So we'll kind of keep on rolling into some of those pieces too, as I chat with you about the particular institutions that we have. But just as a quick overview, they're all going to also be providing career services or career development experiences for these students. That's really the thrust of why we want students going to college. So we want to be preparing them for employment. And especially if they're not receiving that traditional associate's or bachelor's degree, we want them to come out with really hard skills from the classes that they've taken, but also just from employment development and just some of those strategies that they need to develop with support. So they're going to go through readiness skills development. They're going to do job coaching and do employment progression during their time role. They'll start with internships on campus and then paid employment on campus, and ideally working with DVR to get them paid employment off campus before they graduate. That's really our progression. And then all the while, students are working on independence. So our universities that I'll chat about, they have on-campus living options where peer mentors support that natural engagement with living independently on a college campus. And if students, they don't have to live on the college campus if that's offered, but they're still going to be learning person-centered planning, self-advocacy, determination, all of those pieces that really equip them for their future. So these are 4 institutions that currently exist. As a reminder, we are in the process actually right now of institutions being able to apply for grant funding to start more of these programs in the state. So you've got Elevate at Arapahoe Community College, which is in Littleton, Colorado. They're a 3-year program. Most of their students are completing their certificate in 3 years. And they're a commuter campus. So there's no on-campus living since it's a community college there. We've got Office of Inclusive Services at UCCS in Colorado Springs. That's a 4-year program, and students do have the availability to live in on-campus apartments. Goal, which is Go On and Learn at UNC in Greeley. Theirs is also a 4-year program with on-campus dorms. And then Regis just started this past fall. So they are here in Denver, which is where I'm at. And they have a unique program where it's not your traditional 4-year program, but it's a 1-year path or a 2-year path. And they also have on-campus dorms and are really growing exponentially into this coming year. So all of these programs are a part of our consortium. So we work with them, we work with their staff to make sure that they're really working towards inclusion, supporting their students in all of those 4 pillars. And then all of them have received what we call comprehensive transition and post-secondary program status, which means that students enrolled in these programs can access federal financial aid. So they can access federal grants and federal work study. But because of their outcome, that modified certificate, they do not have access to federal loans. But that CTP status still allows all families that are in these programs to complete a FAFSA and to see what federal grants and work study they can receive. And that is really, really big for our students that are pursuing this pathway, because lots of families with students with intellectual disabilities never considered college in the future. And so therefore the planning and financial preparation wasn't really in place until kind of last minute. So that CTP status essentially means that these programs have met a long list of criteria to show inclusion and development and meaningful outcomes. And therefore the federal government wants to offer financial aid as able to those institutions. Go ahead, Rim.
I have another question on the certificates. I know internships and apprenticeships sometimes create certificates. Tell me about the standing of the certificates in the greater community. Are they targeted toward what outside entities have asked for? To me, what is the standing on those certificates for them?
Good question. So these certificates are really created at the institutional level. So it's not like a hospitality certificate that a person's going to go and pursue. It's called the Comprehensive Higher Education Certificate, which just kind of has a breakdown of 2 inclusive courses each semester with a 1 direct instruction course. But what students do is they come and they say, here's my area of study. So a number of students can be pursuing that comprehensive certificate, but they have an emphasis. So I have a comprehensive certificate with an emphasis in education. And so they're going to be able to take that certificate to whatever employer they have to say, here are the key classes that I took that are going to help me with skills. So it's not necessarily a community certificate. It's an institutional certificate from each of those places. The fact that all of our programs have that and it's transferable. So we've had some students start with their certificate at ACC and then transferred over to UNC and continued on with that. The fact that that is happening means that it's going to carry more and more weight the more graduates that we see going out into the community with that certificate in hand. But I think with some of our upcoming programs, we're seeing more of a lean towards some of those community-based certificates. I know a college here in Denver are really focusing on hospitality, and they're going to try to pursue that certificate with students in this type of a program too. So I think that's coming down the line. But right now, this is really, how do we take essentially a bachelor's degree at an institution and narrow it down to the essential classes that a student would need in their particular area of study? Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah, great questions on that. Love it. So real quick, this just kind of points to how students get to choose really whatever they're interested in that's offered at that institution. So we've got students that have taken photojournalism, human services, exercise science, communications, dance, and government. So really our students, they've seen these doors open to a lot of opportunity for them where they're able to hone in on key skills that they really love. And obviously within those areas of study, they're not taking every single course that a traditional student would. They're pulling from that list to say, what are the essential ones that are really going to help me build those tangible skills to get the particular job that I'm looking for? So here are some of the outcomes that we're seeing. We've had 32 graduates since 2020, and we have another 12 graduating this May, which is exciting. But we've had some students that have graduated with their education emphasis or community service emphasis. And we have one student that just got hired full-time as a para-educator in her hometown after graduating from Goal. Elnez, she became an administrative assistant after studying business. Darius is in graphic design. We have several students like Caitlin and Paige that are teacher assistants. That's really the route that they wanted. So they're full-time in their school system as a teacher assistant. Jasmine was working more in the medical area. And so she is working now in the nutrition department at a hospital. Ashley is a self-advocate working for one of our ARCs. Mia is teaching ASL lessons. Mark is working as an athletic assistant at a university. And then a couple of our students are coming back to their programs as ambassadors, working as tour guides and promoting this to the freshman class, which has been really exciting to see. So when we look at this, and you can see that blue box on the right side as well, where it says these students are 3 times more likely to be employed than if they were to not pursue inclusive higher education. That is not just because of the courses that they're taking. There's a lot to be said about the personal development that they experience during this inclusive setting. Where they're more marketable in a lot of ways. And so we're seeing higher than 75% employment rate with our students that are graduating as they're going back to their hometowns and navigating things with DVR, but we're really seeing an increase in the job opportunity that they have, seeing job diversity in their futures, which is really exciting for us.
Can you speak to that just a moment more about how this dovetails with DVR?
Yes. So all of our program staff and we as a nonprofit, we work closely with DVR for all of their counselors to know what our programs are, what their purpose is as they're preparing students for employment. And so a lot of times, and families can even access financial support from DVR if they pursue inclusive higher education. So a lot of times our program staff will meet with families and make sure that they're in line and connected with the DVR counselor, because really as they get towards junior, senior year within these programs, they want to be closely knit with that DVR counselor so that they're looking at job opportunities in their hometown that would align with their experiences during college. And so that there's a soft toss or pass off, I would say. So they start working with them closely during those latter years of the programs, but ideally we have DVR involved from the very beginning, just supporting the work that's happening and kind of keeping an eye on the goals of their employment, and then being able to take that and really run with it after they graduate. Because when students are in the programs, they have an employment coordinator within their programs on their campus that helps with job support as needed, helps with job support in the community. But when they transition out of that zone or they go back to a hometown, then DVR would really need to kick in and offer that on-site support.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so now I love speaking to this, and I don't know how often it's heard in the K-12 realm, but Universal Design for Learning is kind of this up and coming, really growing pedagogy, teaching pedagogy that's being implemented at a lot of community colleges, but also universities. And so a lot of times it's put to the side as, well, once they get to college, if that's what their professors want to do, we'll go with it. But there's so many meaningful components from UDL that I think can be started to be implemented during the K-12 timeframe and teaching and instruction. So I'm just going to give a picture of UDL, what we're seeing at the college level, and maybe some strategies to implement during the K-12 classroom. And then we'll go into more of those key preparation strategies. But a lot of times what we see are assumptions from educators that the college classroom culture is very, very traditional, just lecture based, which is still very much a possibility. There are absolutely lots of professors and faculty that they love this. They have the content and they're pouring it out over students, and students are intended just to sit and listen and retain. But we've seen so many studies done over the years that this is not the best way to engage learners, whether they have a disability or not. It's just not the most engaging way for students to be interacting with new information. So really what we're seeing is a movement towards interactive learning, more engagement within the college classrooms, more diversity in how they're instructing. And it's really funneling through this Universal Design for Learning method. So this is just the brief description of what UDL is often referred to. So UDL provides a blueprint for creating instructional goals, methods, materials, and assessments that work for everyone. Not a single one-size-fits-all solution, but rather flexible approaches that can be customized and adjusted for individual needs. So really what we mean by all of that is that changes that are made to curriculum or how we're instructing, changes that we would make for individuals with disabilities or higher needs, actually mutually benefit every learner. So a really good real world example of this is the ADA door opening system. So that was put in place for those with mobility limitations that can't open the door on their own, so they can hit that button and it's open for them. Benefits that particular individual. But it also benefits able-bodied individuals when they're carrying too many groceries into their apartment, or when they have too many things in their way and they can knock that and it opens the door for them. So that change made for an individual with a disability or higher need actually benefits the entire community. So the same is true at the cognitive level and at the teaching level. So maybe an example would be, for a lot of our students with intellectual disabilities, their content is very image focused to kind of give them image of vocabulary or concepts. But actually, inputting images on all content benefits all learners. So that's really the baseline of universal design for learning, is that the changes we make for those with higher needs actually benefits everybody. So there's 3 categories of how universal design is being implemented at the college level and just in a general setting. So emphasizing the multiple means of engagement for students, multiple means of representation of information, and then multiple means of how they actually express their learning, their mastery of that information. And it's really cracking open, not just the black and white, I speak to you in a lecture and you turn in a paper, but really seeing how can we engage learners more uniquely. So the way that this is broken down at the UDL guidelines website is those 3 categories, which is engagement, representation, and then assessment. Those are kind of broken down by the why, the what, and then the how. Those are kind of the best ways that I describe them. So when you're thinking of the why of instruction, the why of content, what it's really encouraging is that we clearly communicate or show the objective, show the relevance of the information that we're offering. This is really big in college classrooms to say, what's the purpose of all this reading that I'm doing? What's the purpose of these concepts? And I think the same is true for our K-12 learners. They're going to engage more deeply with information when they know clearly why it's important. So clearly stating that, giving relevance for why you're teaching what you're teaching. Prompting students to clearly communicate and reflect on why they are learning that said skill. So not just telling them why, but helping them process through that. Why is this going to be important to me? What scenario would I find myself needing to implement this knowledge in? Things like that. And then this is a really big component where we're creating space for student choice. So instead of saying, here's content I'm giving you, here's the only way you can give it back to me, is asking them what's the best way that they can engage with this content. And I'll give some examples to that in a little bit. But a great way to do that is providing options for resources as natural learning support. So for students who maybe get unmotivated pretty quickly or feel kind of overwhelmed by assignments or tasks, offering lists of resources that they can just find on their own as kind of a coach for them to re-engage with information, come on back to the why, the motivation that they have for that information. Another thing that we're really seeing be pushed with this engagement piece is collective and collaborative learning. So many individuals will solidify their learning and their knowledge development in a social setting. When they can talk about it or reteach it to somebody at their own level. And so there's a component of asking students to collectively discuss information. That is not super prominent, I would say, in K-12 spaces, or more specifically in special education spaces, because of the diversity of communication styles. But we see a really big value of helping students to just talk through information, talk through relevance of information, and really share that with one another. This also encourages providing benchmarks to help students with regulating how they're completing assignments, how they're tracking with knowledge development. But really at the baseline, we're asking that educators would communicate the why behind their instruction. And then a lot of the changes that actually happen is this what. So how you're actually presenting or what you're actually presenting. So there's a call to vary the format of information for all students. So some examples, and these are not the only ways that students learn. These are not the only categories of learners, but some really common ones are auditory, visual, experiential, social, and written. So for example, when you're presenting information, when you're teaching a class, make sure that you're incorporating auditory components. Use assistive technology. Have a screen reader. So a student that might require a screen reader for every single assignment, it's actually really beneficial to have a screen reader read aloud a prompt or some kind of information to the entire class. It normalizes the use of that assistive technology, but it also provides auditory support for students that otherwise would just have to read it. Having visual support, as I mentioned, is going to benefit every learner. So a lot of times we would create like separate packets. These have the images for the student. This has the more written language for the student, but really merging those together so that all students can see the benefit of both. Having activities, having discussion and group work is going to be really valuable. And then even in written format, changing the way that written format can be offered. So sentence structures, maybe songs, maybe emails, where you're just allowing them to put together their concepts in different formats, where it doesn't have to be this structured paragraph or paper. Offering lots of background information as you're presenting information is big. This is going to teach students how to re-engage with something that you've provided to help them, jog their memory, but also how to review as they're digging deeper into it. So just going back to resources and providing those options for students. And then as you're presenting information, always restating the why. So truthfully, just at the beginning of every class, why are we talking about this again? It might feel redundant, it might feel repetitive, but it helps students solidify the purpose of what they're learning. And then here's really the big shift at the college level, is that now there's some changes into how students are showing their mastery of that information. So again, I'm going to speak to some of these common learning styles. So maybe if a student, if you're presenting content on a reading, you're reading as a class, you're using diverse options, showing different ways of information, maybe showing videos and using that assistive technology. And at the end, you want students to show what they've learned, what they've gained from that unit of reading. So allowing students to select which option that they want to complete in order to show you mastery of that information. So maybe students can have an auditory option where instead of writing paper, they do an interview with you, indicating what they've learned, hitting key points of expectations, but it's more of an interactive interview. Maybe for visual learners, they can select graphic organizers where they break down the concepts that they've learned in visual format. Experiential learners, allowing them to do a presentation where it's a little bit more hands-on and active, or maybe you observe them in a specific setting to assess their mastery. For social learners, doing some group work activities, or for written learners, paragraph format with guides or prompted questions. So what we encourage is that teachers would have a format where they offer a few options for every single assignment that's being submitted. So all students are working towards that same goal, but they can select different levels of how they're actually showing their growth and their knowledge in that content.
Can I make a comment?
Go ahead, yeah.
Hey, so my previous assignment was superintendent, and my work was effective practices. I'm telling you, this is spot on. This is right in the middle of effective practices. What the research says, that not only teachers that are preparing special ed students for in type assignments, all students.
Yeah.
This what you're saying right now should be taught in GT classrooms. So I really appreciate how spot on this is as far as effective practices for everyone. So appreciate the work.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ram. I appreciate that. But yeah, I think, I found that just in my work in general, working with populations of students with disabilities, I've had lots of educators come to me and say, like, what do you do? Like, how do you really work with them? And I'll provide just some strategies. And at the end of it, we say, well, this is beneficial for everybody. There's no like magic to special education. There's lots of intentionality for sure. But yeah, these strategies are mutually beneficial. That's kind of my language for all of it.
Yeah. Yeah, what works for GT kids works for all kids.
Right.
And the special ed students are just more teacher dependent. Some GT kids might get it on their own, but this would help them as learn as well. So anyway, I think that's a great point. Yeah. These are effective practices, not just for a target population. It should be for all. So thanks.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Rim. Well, and this kind of this image, which is a little bit grainy, I apologize if it's hard to read, but this gives kind of a picture of what used to be the case at the college level. And I also think at the K-12 level, it's really what we want to move towards with that enriched information, interactive guidance and learning. So it used to be read these different paragraphs and it's all one format of engagement, read, and then maybe write to assess. But now a good example that we're seeing for units would be read a paragraph introducing a topic, then study a diagram in depth, then look at an illustration that's a little bit more imaginative and creative, then read additional text, watch and listen to a video on YouTube, where we're just pulling in all these types of representation for the same information so that all the different parts of our brains are firing and really engaging in that learning. And then really challenging students to identify what is the best way that they show their knowledge, not having to be limited or morphed into that written form, but maybe they show their knowledge in some more unique ways. So it takes more effort, I would definitely say. So I know as educators listen to this, that can feel daunting to kind of change the way in which you're accepting information or accepting assignments from students. But I think you'll be so encouraged by how you see students come alive in their learning, become more aware of how they engage in information. So that effort is worth it. So let me talk just really quickly of how I think this kind of transitions into K-12 more specifically. So a lot of when I went through my undergrad in special education, we talked so much about differentiated instruction, which is wonderful, right? A lot of times that you're in a classroom with severe support needs students at all different levels. And so you're creating multiple packets of information for multiple students with multiple goals. And it's a lot of keeping track of a lot of different levels of goals and assignments and just completion of work, right? To make sure that we're actually tracking how they're growing and learning. And this really challenges educators to not just do the differentiated instruction, but to go more towards diversified instruction. And what I mean by that is the same goal, the same target for all students, but allowing them to select how they're showing their growth in that particular target. And this is what we're doing with our students in inclusive higher education programs. So they're coming into a college communication class, and those expectations of the class are not shifting. The expectations of understanding communication styles, completing a speech, those expectations are in place. And what we do, instead of altering those expectations, we work with the student to identify how can they show growth towards that expectation. So what we really see is high expectations are going to be required for students as you're setting goals for them. And whether it's a traditional goal or extended evidence outcomes, that we're setting high standards for those goals and then just changing the way in which they're showing that they're meeting them or growing within them.
So that begs a question. So alternative students who do not receive a diploma are still eligible for this program?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. So a big piece of this, and we say this a lot in inclusive higher education, is that it's going to require educators to presume competence. And a lot of times we don't realize that we subconsciously limit our students when we limit their goals, or we only think we've seen them show growth in this particular area, and we therefore do not set high expectations or high standards for them. But when we come to this population of students with ID and presume their competence, and then when they show need of support, we offer that progressively. But if we start with presumed competence, I think we're going to be really encouraged and surprised by how our students meet those expectations. That's a lot of anecdotally what we're seeing from our students coming to college. So they once were in severe support needs classrooms. We serve several students with Down syndrome, multiple disabilities, all of those pieces, that they were not challenged in their high expectations. And then they're coming to college coursework and all of a sudden expected to reach these high standards, and it can feel really overwhelming, but it's been so cool to see them step into it and to say, no, I want to challenge myself. I want to grow cognitively. And so really presuming competence and instilling that growth mindset in the K-12 setting is going to set them up for so much success. And I think we're going to see as educators so much more growth in our students. And a big component of this is creating a classroom environment of choice. This allows students to start to understand how they learn, why they're learning, the ways in which they show their learning best, and where they're able to select that, because they are going to have those level of choices within inclusive higher education programs. That's a lot of what we're looking at. And as I've mentioned, that really just establishes their self-awareness, where they know how they're learning, what their strengths are, their weaknesses are, and therefore they can be more independent as learners at the higher education level or just in the future in general. Okay, so I speak when I was working at Elevate at Arapahoe Community College, a lot of what I mentioned before, where I was meeting with educators saying, what's the trick? How do I really work with these students? Again, there's nothing magical about this. These are great traditional practices for any classroom. But I like to just encourage these baseline general techniques that educators can start with. Chunking is not the most attractive term, but is a great term for how to progressively show information. So this screen is a version of chunking. So I am taking one bullet point at a time, rather than just showing you my entire screen all at once. Chunking allows students' attention to be focused on one key piece of information at a time. That helps with a lot of our students that are often overstimulated. Maybe they get distracted by lots of things on a page or in a book. And so chunking, by limiting one thing at a time, it really allows them to track with your thought process a little bit more thoroughly. We encourage students with textbooks to take pieces of paper and cover anything that they're not reading and just read one paragraph at a time, right? Eliminate some of that distraction so that we're honing in on one key idea. And then this is a progression, what I call gradual release of responsibility. And I think a lot of times, the ability for this to take place in a K-12 classroom is going to be dependent on the culture of your paraeducators or the support that you receive in the classroom, where you want to have an entire team holding students to high standards. And so what we see is progressing through guidance where you're allowing students, you're fading some supports of students. So we encourage you to start with the I do it. So I being the teacher, establish that objective, establish what the expectations are, set the tone for what you're desiring your students to accomplish. Give a tangible example and do it independently so that they can observe. And then move to doing it together. So maybe that's some modeling, using visual and audio examples where you're doing something together. Might feel repetitive to what you just did, but the students participating with you kind of has that comfort of your guidance. And then moving it to you do it together, students. So that's really the social engagement piece. Now I want students to try doing this. And as an educator, I'm going to walk around and I'm going to observe, where are students thriving? Where are they not? What are they not understanding in terms of expectations? And then finally, you do it independently. So students moving towards independence. Doing things with independence in the special education classroom might mean potential for failure. And that's really okay and good. We're seeing a lot of our students coming to the college level and never in their life did they receive something below an A, even if their work didn't necessarily deserve that. And so we're really encouraging educators to be honest with students as they're doing work independently, because failure is an area for students to grow in. And maybe failure is not even the right word, but not meeting all of the expectations allows them to see, here's what I can develop in over time. So really moving through this progression, and that could be over time, that could be in one class time, it doesn't matter, but just having this in the back of your mind, I do it, we do it, you guys do it, and now you do it independently. And yes, absolutely, Rim, I see your comment of that instills grit, where they have to learn, okay, I didn't nail this time, but how do I come back to that same problem? How do I come back to that same concept and reimagine it and rethink it and learn? And I think for our students with more severe disabilities, our assumption is that can't happen, but it can. It just might take longer, but it absolutely can happen. That growth can happen. Another component that I love is using guided instruction techniques. So this is kind of a three-pronged process for students. A lot of times I've worked with maybe peer mentors or educators that sit down with a student with an intellectual disability and almost spoon feed information to them, and hoping that that's just the best way for them to take it in. But really the best way to understand what students need and where their level of understanding is to start with open-ended questions. And that would mean that we're hanging in some awkward silence a lot of times, but giving wait time for students to process your question and actually believe that you're waiting on them to respond, rather than just filling that silence with your own input. It teaches them to think critically and to either communicate what they know or communicate that they don't know. And I would much rather students with disabilities communicate that they don't know first before we feed them information than us just assuming they don't know. So we want to start with open-ended questions, giving them as much space to show what they're understanding or what they're not. And then as educators, you can start to fill in some of those gaps. So from there, if they answer a question, maybe not as completely as you desired, then you can prompt them to recall information. So even then, we don't want to give them the immediate fix. Say, well, let's look back on, or what are some resources that you have that might help you answer that question more fully? Prompt them to some things that are in their backpack, things that are available online, just kind of engaging their brain to think of where else could I get more information on that? And if we're still falling short, then you can give that direct cue of, okay, student A, I know that the answer to this is going to be on the handout that I gave you yesterday. Can you pull that out? So it's really moving from that open-ended, allowing students to fill in what they know or do not know, prompting them to think of other ways to add to that, and then cueing them directly to resources to help them process and answer that more fully. Questions or input on that at all, Rim? I'm going to get into some of the tangible skills. So,
well, I just sent that.
Yes, you froze a bit on me, but I'm seeing your comment now. Awesome. I love that. Okay. Can you hear me okay? I know you were freezing on my end, so.
Yeah, it just froze right there, and I don't know if it's me or you, but anyway, what I just said there was exactly what you were talking about. Is if you can get the students to process out loud, especially when they're wrong, that's when the learning begins. So that's where instruction begins. So I think that's just spot on, perfect.
Absolutely. Well, we've had students in inclusive higher education that are nonverbal students, but they have assistive technology. And a lot of times that student was not asked those verbal processing questions. But at the college level, we asked him, because he can communicate at his own level using that assistive technology. So it doesn't matter the level of cognition. That kind of practice is really helpful. So I did mention that I want to point out some of the unique skills that we see at the college level that are not as common at the higher or at the K-12 level. And I think, Rim, this is where you might see some of the commonalities between our last educator webinar. But some unique skills that I think is just important to have on our radar. Educators, K-12 educators, special educators. I know you guys have a million things to be thinking of. So my goal is not to load you up with more expectations, but just to have this as kind of like a back pocket resource of like, oh, maybe I can implement 1 to 2 of these things in this next unit or semester, whatever it might be. And then over time, really building a culture, a classroom culture of college preparation. But one of the big ones that students are so surprised by is a syllabus at the college level. And so following a syllabus, a lot of times our faculty are going to say, have you checked the syllabus? Have you looked in the syllabus? And so it's really great for students to have that experience from K-12. Excuse me. So I encourage educators to provide outlines as a starting point. Here's an outline of our assignments, an outline of our expectations, or even to create a full syllabus for each of their units and have frequent time that you're referring back to that, or having students check on the assignment list so that they're not reliant on a teacher in the room to provide them that answer, but they're being coached through. You have a resource that's going to answer that question that you have. How can you go back to do that on your own? Note-taking is a really big strategy that I think is going to be beneficial at the college level, but also at the employment level. When you're in a staff meeting, how many times have I forgotten what was said in a staff meeting because I didn't take my own notes? So even when you're communicating the why behind note-taking instruction, thinking beyond the college classroom, note-taking is going to be really beneficial. So I would encourage teachers to offer like note-taking templates to their students, just helping them summarize what was the main idea here? What are 2 tasks that I need to do after this lesson? What questions do I have? It could be very basic, but that at least engages them in thinking through, not just passively listening, but trying to pull out information to write down and recall at a later time. Prompting students to identify important information to note. So a lot of times this might mean, this is really important. I want you to write it down, like as explicit as that can be. But also just helping them identify vocabulary is really big for them to write down and recall. Due dates are really important for them to write down and recall, just kind of prompting them through those common things to identify and note. And then helping students establish preferred note-taking systems. So every student, as we mentioned, they're different. They're unique in how they learn, and therefore they're going to be unique in how they want to take notes and how that might best serve them. And so some students might need electronic folders where they're going to be typing in Word. That really helps their brain. Or maybe they need spiral notebooks that are labeled by subject or topic. Or maybe students need access to a recording device that they listen back to as kind of their note-taking reflection. And so helping students determine what's their system of note-taking is going to be great, so that when you're up in the front of the class and you prompt them to take notes on something, they can all do it at their own individualized level based on what they've selected and worked with you on. Study skills is also something a lot of our students within SSN classrooms is not something that they've developed because the assessments are far less than our students in general courses. But it's really important for students to start to develop some just general practices of what I call preview and review time. So any time before I come into a college class, or if I was going with the student to a college class, we'd spend 15 minutes before that class time previewing. Maybe if I know what chapter of the textbook we're reading today or talking about today, let's review what that outline of the chapter is. Let's look at the headings. Let's look at the diagrams and the graphics on those pages, just so I can kind of preview and prepare my brain for the information that's to come. And then 15 minutes after class, let's review what notes you just took. Does that make sense to you? What questions do we have where it's all kind of fresh in our mind? That's just a really great learning engagement skill that also is going to set students up great for studying, where they're going to say, hey, I know how to go back to this textbook, or I know how to go back to my notes and preview and review them. Quizlet is a really common quizzing and study skill system that students use at the college level. So even having that within your classroom and all going through it together, it's kind of interactive where you flip an electronic card. But if you create that as an educator, that Quizlet, it kind of just shows students, and you have them interact with you in it, that's a really typical rhythm of learning, that we don't just learn it passively, but we got to go back to it. We got to keep on reviewing. Class discussions are going to be very common at the college level. And so starting those in special education classrooms is big. And a common way that I encourage this is just a simple think, pair, and share. So asking a question and giving ample time for students to personally think. Say, this is your think time. I want you to think about your answer to this question. Maybe write it out for me. Maybe draw an example of it for me using those multiple modalities. Think about your answer to this question. And in 5 minutes, I'm going to pair you up with somebody near you. And I want you guys then to share with one another. What did you think? And just kind of guiding them through that 3-step process kind of helps them see the importance of developing your own perception, your own thoughts, and then sharing them with other learners. That's going to help them in the class discussion environment at the college level. And a lot of times, if this is something that's ingrained in students, they engage more naturally in college discussion. For students that have not had experiences like that, we see lots of blurting out information that maybe doesn't make sense to the class discussion, or maybe not engaging at all, just kind of becoming a ghost because it's overwhelming, or just feeling like they're missing everything. So this small picture of a class discussion can be a really great way to help students have confidence and some strategy to present meaningful information, because what they think about the information is important. We have an instructor that talked about when she first had students with intellectual disabilities in her intro to reading course at the college level. She said, I was really concerned that they would add disruption to my class. But instead, I found that they added depth to my class discussions. They were honest, they were vulnerable, they created this culture of vulnerability that really helped her instruction just kind of root deeply with their learners. And I love that our students with intellectual disabilities have something to add to class discussions. And so I think helping them develop that strategy early on is going to really encourage them and set them up for that success. This is kind of in line with some of that preview and review that I mentioned, but we really want students to develop how to prepare for class, how to be thinking proactively about their coursework or about expectations at a job. So something that I think is really helpful is providing your students, even with a visual on a whiteboard, preparation checklist. Before we get into this unit or this particular time of our day, let's just list out what are the things that I might need to have with me. Were there handouts that were given to me by my teacher yesterday? Are there books that I should have with me? Are there notes that I should have with me? And just kind of verbally guiding them through that is going to help instill that rhythm in them so that when they end up at the college level, or if they're going to a job, they have a practice of before they leave the house, what's my checklist? What are the things I have to hit? What are the things that are going to help me engage fully? Communication with instructors is really big. A lot of times our students in the K-12 level lean into others communicating for them. And so we really want to build up them communicating for themselves. So a big piece that I see is having students meet one-on-one with the teachers that they're working with if they're in general classes, or para educators if they're in their special education class. And even if they know what's on the IEP, even if those educators know, having the students sit down and say, here are the accommodations and modifications I need. Let's talk about it. Providing space for them to communicate those needs with the support at the K-12 level is going to be huge for their self-advocacy, their self-awareness, and their ability to communicate. Another great format of helping them prepare for communication is to offer weekly email practice. Email communication is just how it goes at the college level, and that can be a big wake-up call for our high school students. And so having a set 15 minutes before students leave for the day, let's all pull up our emails, or maybe let's practice writing an email to a paraeducator about an assignment that you might need help with, or to a peer mentor about an assignment you might need help with, just kind of guiding them through that regular rhythm. And then these last two college skills they can go together. Technology know-how is like overarching, but really what I think of when I think of quality of work for students is so many of the students I've worked with in the past, they'll kind of scribble through assignments and pass it in because they're just assuming their grade is going to be, I don't know, all stars, A's, all those things. They're not thinking that they're going to be challenged and graded according to the effort that they put in. So we really want to challenge students to put forth their best effort, believe in that growth mindset on their own. And so we really encourage them to take time before they submit an assignment to reflect back on the assignment expectations. A good way to do that at K-12 is just providing really brief rubrics. Doesn't have to be extensive, doesn't have to be a whole list of things, but a really clear rubric. What are the key concepts you're hoping to see so that students can look back? Did I hit that? Did I incorporate pieces of that? So rubrics are really great to review. And then also just including Grammarly or proofreading support. So if before a student turns in a paper, say, hey, I'm going to give you 10 minutes to go back to your desk and just reread that for me and make sure that's the best of your ability. And maybe it is, and that's great, and they'll be all the more confident, but just creating some pockets of proofreading and slowing down so that the quality of work is really high. And then the technology know-how, helping students to complete their assignments on Microsoft or Office software if they're able. That's really going to be great for them to know how to use Google Docs or Word. And that's also going to clue in with some of that proofreading support, helping them understand what is that red squiggly line that's underneath your word, and what does that mean for you, and kind of coaching them through those pieces. And then really encouraging students to use assistive technology. So audiobooks, having them just trial that. They may not think that they need it, but it can really benefit their learning. It does for me. Google dictation. So Google, you can pull up a Google Doc and start dictation where you just speak out what you're thinking, and then you can edit from there. And that's a free service for anybody. Practicing some of those systems is going to really help them to know what technology is going to help them engage with the college classroom. So these are some of just those unique college skills that we don't often see at the K-12 level, but I think are really valuable nonetheless. Do you have any input or questions on that, Ram?
No, ma'am. Thank you.
Great. So I've talked about this in several other webinars where there's not just the academic preparation. College is so much more than that. It develops students so much more than that. And so a lot of times what we do see at the K-12 or transition age is focusing so much on self-determination and self-advocacy that we forget some of those academic places or academic skills. So I see there's so much importance of having both. So developing those academic engagement skills, but also there's going to be some non-academic skills that are great to incorporate as well. So I'm just going to kind of blaze through these. These are all provided by Think College, which is the National Coordinating Center for All-Inclusive Higher Education. They have so many wonderful resources for educators, for students, for families. And so they have this long list of what are some key skills for college readiness. And this is some of the ones that I've pulled out as non-academic skills that are still really valuable. So learning how to communicate needs to others, anticipating needs, which is something that so many college students are working on. I am often working on, and advocating for your own needs, having mutual respect for those around you, having a flexible attitude, being able to take risks responsibly, knowing that you might flounder, fail, struggle, but you can grow and learn through that risk taking. Having interpersonal skills, how to just engage with the peers around you, and having curiosity, asking questions, and pursuing those questions and not just letting them linger. Persistence, or what we mentioned earlier, that grit mentality of how do we overcome challenges and keep on learning and growing even when it's not easy. Taking responsibility for expectations and things in our life, collaborating with others, engaging in independence, taking ownership of the things that you want to pursue. And then engagement, just really having an interactive process with those around you. So I tend to kind of merge these all into a few key categories of self-awareness, where I really encourage educators to help students at the K-12 level understand their disability, not as the only part about them, but as a part about them. So learning how to discuss what that looks like, how does it impact them? How does it make them different and unique? What are their strengths and their weaknesses in accordance with that? And really, that can take place in an IEP meeting where students are able to ask questions and understand what their needs are. But we really, at the college level, whether they go through inclusive higher education or just traditional disability services, students have to self-identify their diagnosis and their need for accommodations or modifications. And so it's really important for them to be able to articulate that, or have support in articulating that. And then also within self-awareness, allowing them to define their career interests. This often comes through them pursuing that curiosity piece, helping them look through not just the traditional expectations of what careers look like, but Googling the heck out of one interest that they have and seeing what are the options. onetonline.org is a wonderful resource to see long lists of different jobs in a general category. That has been really wonderful for students that I work with, where they just never considered, oh, that would link to some form of education that I want to pursue. Pursuing self-advocacy and decision-making on a daily basis. This goes back to even those assignments that you're offering, giving them choice in how they're showing their knowledge and how they're showing their growth is going to increase decision-making ability, where they're deciding, this is why I want to do it this way, based on my skills and my preferences. It's a great place for them to implement that. Self-management, so having students maintain their own schedule and personal regulation. This should look like fading supports for them to get from class to class or getting around campus, really helping them do that with independence. And when issues arise, helping them problem solve accordingly. Where do we go if we get lost? Who would we contact? What would be a good next step? And then that personal regulation piece is identifying when we're in an environment that maybe is not best suited for us and how we can remove ourselves appropriately from that environment. What are some coping strategies I can use in that environment? We've helped lots of students just kind of have a list of like, what are 3 coping mechanisms that you're going to need when you're feeling overwhelmed or stressed, and just having those on repeat in conversation so that they know to come back to them. And then self-determination and goal setting and planning. All of that is there's so much in that in terms of self-determination, but really helping students identify, what are my goals? Why are those my goals? What do I want to pursue? What do I want to grow in? And what are the steps to get there? So really identifying those future focused goals and then the planning of those small steps along the way. We just encourage our K-12 educators to start incorporating these early on so that they can see their students really reaching high standards. I think we've seen that happen in so many of our classrooms, and hopefully it's encouraging and not overwhelming, but I'm open for any questions or input that you have. So these are resources for how to learn more about inclusive higher education in particular. So our website, we also have 5 self-paced modules for educators that really go through the history of disability services in higher education, strategies for helping students pursue inclusive higher ed in Colorado, really helpful. It's a total of about 3 credit hours that we can provide a certificate for. So we really encourage educators to jump on that. You can do that at your own pace, but they do a little bit more of a deep dive for you. We have upcoming webinars that are hopefully helpful for you. And if you ever want to get plugged in with our newsletter, we send out a monthly newsletter about what's happening in our programs. There's always a student story in there, so you can see what's the impact on the students that we serve. And then this is a list of that Think College, those national resource hubs. A bunch of different tools that have been helpful for the educators we worked with, things focused on IEP goals, some checklists for skills and all those pieces. So those are just great links to look into.